Today's episode of the 6Ps podcast is going to focus on the background information for Euripides' text, The Women of Troy. So today we're going to focus on a couple of these aspects. We're going to look at Euripides. We're going to look at what life was like in classical Greece. We'll dip our toe into the Peloponnesian Wars and look a little bit at Greek mythology, which shapes this play. Now, in order to fully understand the text, it is absolutely imperative that you have a strong grasp of the social, cultural, and historical context in which this play is found. Now, today we're going to provide you with a bit of a snapshot, but we're definitely going to be encouraging you to go out and undertake your own research, because this knowledge can be called upon in your essays for the SAC as well as the exam, but particularly the SAC, where there is a really strong focus on having an understanding and comprehension of the world in which the text is set and written as well. And similar to, I guess, the Crucible, we've got these dual contexts to an extent involved here. So let's have a look at classical Greek society, which is when this text was first performed. It's important to denote the difference between ancient Greece and classical Greece, but this is definitely classical Greece that we are looking at. It's between those Persian wars. Women in this society were treated as inferior. They definitely weren't considered citizens and they had no voting rights, which is particularly pertinent in Athens, where democracy and voting was considered quite significant for that time. It was a great source of pride for them. They definitely were limited to domestic duties. They definitely didn't fight in wars, and they were treated, particularly in this text at times, as these really sort of sexual objects, as these trophies of war. The gods, they played an integral role in everyday life in classical Greece. And while we have these, Athens and Sparta, which have these different values and beliefs in terms of the way a city-state should run, they definitely shared the same beliefs in terms of religion and the gods. And these gods were able to dictate their lives. And if they didn't live their lives right, then the gods would punish them. So they saw gods playing a really important role in the way their lives played out. Another important aspect, of course, is the theatre, which, as I mentioned before, was a really male-dominated forum. Not only was the audience made up of all men, but so too the cast. So all female characters were in fact played by men, and often masks were worn to show that. And the last aspect I want to focus on is war, and I'll touch on this in a little bit later on as well, but it was ever present throughout these times, and it was also glorified, and that's what makes The Women of Troy a really interesting play, because Euripides doesn't promote it at all. In fact, he condemns it. And that's what makes this play have such, I guess, for me anyway, why I think it's such an impressive piece of work, because it sort of goes against the general thought of society at the time. And I can see why it would have been considered, or maybe the fact it wouldn't have been as celebrated at the time, given the context and given the fact that a war was in fact going on at the time. Speaking of war, this was written during the Second Peloponnesian War. There were two Peloponnesian Wars, and we've got the dates there. But this one was written during the second one. It was definitely an internal war between Athens, which was a democracy where Euripides lived, and Sparta. And something to note about Sparta is that military training began at just 7 years old. So these citizens were sort of, and again, they were competitors, Athens and Sparta, but Sparta particularly played great emphasis on young boys being soldiers. They fought about territories and colonization, and in the end, it was Sparta that won the war. And Athens became extremely desperate at the end. Not only was it some of these decisions that counted against them, there was also a plague, in fact, that struck Athens during this time. So they were considered to be quite unlucky. But there's two events I want to focus on. The first one is the invasion of Melos, which is also known as the Malign Massacre. And I think it's important, in fact, to reference that, maybe rather, and again, the words invasion and massacre have really negative connotations, but I think it's really important because that's what it was. Melos is an island with quite a small population, and they didn't necessarily pay tribute to Athens, or they sort of refused to. So Athens ended up capturing the island, even though they were neutral in the war. And this was considered to be quite unethical, particularly by Euripides. And he makes this sort of allegory or analogy between Melos and Troy. Now, the Athenian army punished Melos by killing all the men and enslaving the women and children, which of course mirrors what happens in the women of Troy. Something else to consider as well is the Sicilian expedition that was considered a bit of a disaster. Athens was invited by a Sicilian city to fight in their war with Syracuse, who was another Sicilian city. Athens sent a massive fleet of ships to conquer the island, but this backfired, and ambition and greed overcame reason, leading to destruction. The most important part about this is Athens was known for its extremely strong navy, and this had a major impact on that, on decimating that. Just to give you a visual of where these places are, we've got Athens, which is situated there, and Sparta, not too far away from it. Sicily is found further to the west, in fact, a long way to the west. I've just circled there the island of Melos, which you can see is sort of in between Athens and Sparta to an extent. And we've got Troy, which is to the right there. And what you'll notice is that, again, we've got that nice reflection of Troy and Melos here in the play. And something else to point out, that little island there is Mykonos, if you want a place for a nice holiday. Let's move on to mythology, and I'm going to touch on a couple of aspects here, but I cannot stress enough that this is probably the aspect you need to do the most research on, because there are so many references to these Greek myths that you need to know in order to understand the text. And in fact, why that's so important is because the audience would have had knowledge of these and therefore played a role in their understanding and the way they side or sympathize with certain characters. So the first one to look at is the Trojan War, which of course is a mythical war. It was not a real war, it's a mythical war. It's quite famous, or we know it because of course, the horse, the Trojan horse, where the Greek army who were fighting against Troy presented Troy with this horse as a sort of like a peace offering. So Troy accepted the gift, but inside, of course, were Greek soldiers, and at night they escaped the wooden belly of the horse and slayed all the soldiers, and of course they enslaved the women after that and killed all the men. And again, this play is set during the Trojan War. Something else to know about is Cassandra's curse. She is a prophetess. We see her early on in the play in particular. She is demoted to be Agamemnon's sex slave. Now she's cursed because while she is a prophetess, no one else believes her, and that is particularly important and pertinent in terms of why she holds hope at the beginning of the play, and the women sort of brush her off and don't share that same hope for their futures. Agamemnon is subsequently murdered. So not too long after this, he's murdered at the hands of his wife. Why is that important? Well, as he escapes, the audience would already have had an understanding that his fate was sort of sealed. And the same thing goes with the Odysseus voyage, which lasted for 10 years. So the Greek army's return to Greece from Troy lasted 10 years. And that was at the hands of not just nature, but also the gods. There are other myths that I definitely encourage you to learn about. Look at Paris and Alexander. Look at the abduction of Helen, or potential abduction of Helen. That, of course, depends on what side you're on. look at the golden apple of discord. There are so many other myths that you need to look at in order to understand or have a full understanding of this text. And again, this is important to know because this is information the audience would have known. So they understand a little bit more about the characters' fates. And therefore, again, as I said previously, their sympathies will shift accordingly or based on that knowledge that they have. So what are some key takeouts from today? The first thing I would do is definitely read the text as many times as possible. And in particular, read the introduction. We're reading off Don Taylor's translation here, or version. And the first 4 or 5 pages hold really important background information that I definitely encourage you all to read at least twice. Because again, it'll just provide you with that extra understanding of when this text was written and why. Make sure you create a quotation bank based on these themes or based on the key themes and ideas as you read through it, and consider the next level analysis. So think about stage directions. There are a couple of those. They're not quite as rich as they are in Medea, but they're still there. Have a look at symbols, and that could be something, or the one that we always go to, of course, is Hector's shield. And also look at the context information, and you'll find that Euripides does make reference to some of these events throughout the play. So that's why it's really important to look at that historical, social, and cultural context, because it can be utilized in your essays. But as I said, this is just a snapshot. Go out, do your own research, and I look forward to catching you on the 6 Piece podcast very soon.